Louise Cullen from BBC Northern Ireland and Environment and Agriculture correspondent, is going to be our host this evening and bring her personal passion and interest and professional expertise to moderating our evening and to keep the chat flowing. So we look forward to hearing from our guests and from you when you have the opportunity to speak. So without further ado, I will hand over to Louise. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you so much, Hazel. Well, as Hazel said, welcome, and it's my very great pleasure to be with you all here this evening to discuss land and Lough and all things tangential, and faith, of course, the position of that. So this is part of the Season of Creation 2024, and this forum this evening, it's a place where people of all faiths are united by a desire and a responsibility to play a part in protecting and restoring our planet. It's a safe and respectful place where ideas can be tested, opinions explored, and thoughts shared without fear. We are all keenly aware of the environmental, climate, global crisis in which we are living. Here in Northern Ireland, we are largely spared so far the extremes of the catastrophic floods that have afflicted Europe in this past week, and the wildfires that wreaked havoc in Greece and Australia and parts of California this year. But we are seeing our weather patterns changing. We are affected by this. Did everyone enjoy the summer? And I'm not just talking about the last couple of days. That's where it is. That's what it's about. And here we are. We're just 20 miles or so from the shores of Lough. And when I say Lough, you all think of just one thing, and that's blue-green algae. Once again this year, as it likely will for many years to come, regardless of what immediate action we take, the Lough has glowed green with this algae. It's a reminder, visible from space, that we are more than stewards of our land. We are part of this land and we are affected by everything we do upon it. Tonight's event is intended to inspire all of us, to challenge us all to action at our own level as well as community, and above all, it's intended to inspire hope. As human beings, it's my fondest belief we do not do well in despair. Despair demotivates, it paralyses, it becomes destructive. But hope's a different thing. It does motivate and it inspires and it improves the person who hopes as well as the community in which they hope and where that hope is put into practice. So to explore the question of where the churches and their communities fit into this, I'm joined by these two eminent speakers who have been so ably introduced by Hazel already. Martin Palmer is the founding president of Faith Invest, which he established in 2019. He's an international specialist on all major faiths, an author and an editor and a lay preacher. And for the past 23 years, among the many other hats he wears, he's worked with faiths on their investment programmes. And alongside him is John McLenaghan, Deputy President of the Ulster Farmers Union, a farmer from Garva. And alongside his beef and egg enterprises, he has invested time and money in renewable energy on his farm, operating a wind turbine and a biogas plant on site. You've all given us all a very warm welcome already, so thank you for that. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to ask you both to just briefly give us your thoughts on climate change, ecological degradation, and then we'll have a chat. But the important people tonight here are all of you in the audience, so you will have a chance to ask your questions and explore some of what you're going to hear. So Martin, can I come to you first? Give us your insights.
I love the smallness of the scale of the issue you wish us to address. Quickly, two, yes. I want to start in a sense where often we end up. You mentioned hope. And amongst many of the things that I've done in my life, I was for 35 years the religious advisor to His Royal Highness Prince Philip on the environment. Which, as I've commented in the past, was a wee bit like being etiquette advisor to Attila the Hun. But it was also incredibly exciting and thought-provoking and deep. And he and I came up with the idea of WWF when he was the international president of inviting the faiths to come and share what they believed about the environment and to help work with them to create projects. And when we started that, Prince Philip quoted from Proverbs, because one of the problems, I think, of the modern environmental movement, and not modern, I mean, I've been watching this for 40, 50 years, is that it thinks that fear is a good motivating force, and that sin and guilt are why people will do things. Well, I'm a theologian, but I'm also a religious historian, and I can tell you that's wrong. It paralyzes people, and it distorts people, it twists people, it makes them bitter and envious and violent. So we've been following in the environmental movement often a very bad course of motivating people. And Prince Philip certainly saw what we were doing with the faiths as meaning that we were trying to go beyond, in a sense, almost a kind of attempt to create a new religion of guilt, and to go back to the wisdom that the faiths had, that actually it is love and compassion and hope and excitement and celebration. And his quote from Proverbs, when we first talked about this, was the proverb quote, "Without hope, the people perish." Without hope, the people perish. It was written probably 3,000 years ago. And it's as true today as it was then. The other thing that we had to work out was there have been interfaith events before, but I'll be absolutely honest with you. I go to very few interfaith events because they're largely monumentally boring. Because all they do is talk about God. And you know, you don't get very far. I've only ever done what I call multi-faith events when I've had a secular partner. Now, initially it was WWF, and WWF, in a sense, set the context for the discussions. And the faiths were all asked to respond to the fact that WWF was saying to them, what's going on? What's your view on the environment? And by the way, is that pipes playing in the background? Okay, fine. Right? Well, yeah, yes, exactly. That's what I assumed. And so, always, so I've worked with the World Bank. They've been the setters of the questions. I've worked with major other environmental groups, with the UN. Now we have a program with the Green Climate Fund, which I'll come to later. So for me, sitting here with John is exactly what faiths should be doing. They should be sitting side by side. Good Lord. They should be sitting side by side with the secular groups, with the groups that are actually shaping policies and programs, and engaging. Because if we're locked away in our own little ghettos, feeling smug about the fact that we're so environmental, we need to be challenged in that way. And I would also argue that the one thing I think the environmental movement has done for those of us of the Abrahamic faiths is they've been our prophets. And I don't mean the money ones. We have not actually, as faiths, been the groups saying things are going badly wrong and we need to address it. We've had to be challenged to do that. And so I think for me, the essence of what the faith contribution to this is first of all hope, because without it, the people perish. Secondly, it's celebration. When Prince Philip and I designed this big event in Assisi in '86 with the major faiths, he and I both agreed, we did get on extremely well, we both agreed that we should call it a celebration. So we sent out the invitations to all the environmental groups, and back came the responses. You can't possibly call this a celebration. What is there to celebrate? To which we replied, well, if it's not worth celebrating, why would you save it? And I think the final thing I want to throw in at this point in terms of crisis is that we need to rethink who the hell we think we are. And some of you will have heard this story already, so I apologize. But the major religions own about 5% of the 5% of the commercial forest of the world. And most of those are now FSC. But we brought together the major religious forest owners, the churches, Jewish networks, Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, and Shinto. And at this big meeting, we'd been working with the Maronite Church in Lebanon, which is an Orthodox church but linked to the Pope, and they have some amazing sacred forests. And we had helped them create a Maronite protected forest, which made complete sense in their theology. And they got terribly excited and said, what we should do is we should announce that all our forests are faith-protected forests. And pretty much everyone kind of went, yes. And the Shinto went, and I said, what's the problem? They said, but that's nonsense. We don't protect the forests. They protect us. And that's what we've got to get back to, that level of recognition.
Good point to end on. John, your thoughts?
Okay, first of all, I'm glad everybody else can hear the music, because I thought... I was sitting here in a Methodist hall thinking, and I'm hearing band music in Glengormley, and if it's only me is hearing it, there's a big problem. But thank goodness. So they might even have stopped, you never know. But listen, first of all, thanks for the invitation to be here. Sometimes they talk about imposter syndrome when I sat with these two people on either side of me. It's very easy to feel that, but I'm quite happy to give you a perspective, if you like, and I suppose I should preface anything I say by saying I sit here as myself. No, Deputy President of Ulster Farmers Union, but anything I say may not necessarily be the views of the UFU. They always like me to say that in public, actually, so it's good to get good to get that out of the way early. But no, it is. As soon as this came into the office and it wasn't allocated to somebody to do, I was hoping it would come my way, because it is something that interests me and I find quite fascinating, and something we probably haven't, as a society, probably explored enough. So I'm going to throw a few thoughts into it. I think the value in this evening will come from the discussion from the floor, so I very much want to encourage that and to challenge some of the things that I say, and I will deliberately say a few things to try to challenge you to challenge me, so to get that conversation. So hopefully that works. Let's start, I suppose, some stats, and maybe always a good place to start. Last 50 years, we have trebled the amount of meat we produce on this planet. We have doubled the amount of cereals we've produced on this planet. That has been necessary because the number of people on this planet has been growing, but that growth has not been at a zero cost. It has had an impact, and we see that impact around the globe in different ways in different places. Locally, we see it last year in particular, although it had been happening before then, in terms of an algae bloom on Lough caused by excess nutrients from lots of sources, but agriculture being one of them, finding their way into the particular nature of Lough and being trapped there and causing an algae bloom. But we've seen it in other parts of the world very similar, and in other manifestations of a similar sort of thing. So what we've been doing is we've got very good at being farmers, very good at producing stuff, meat, poultry, pig meat, whatever, and also dairy products. And that's what we've been good at. And technology has developed that, especially over 50 years. And I think of my father leaving college in the 50s, not long after the war, when this nation nearly starved. And there was a recognition that actually food security was national security. And we didn't hear that for quite a few decades until Russia invaded Ukraine, and then all of a sudden food security is back on the agenda as national security again, and there's recognition from that at the highest level of government in this country. So that's important. But if we go back to those stats, we have been good at producing food, but we haven't been particularly good, perhaps, at managing what else we produce along with that. So there are other byproducts, you want to call them that. There's the emissions which are associated with it, and the manures and whatever which come from it, and also the fact that in order to, for instance, double the cereal production, we have had to take land perhaps out of forestry. There's been an element of deforestation that's contributed towards that. But the largest part of it probably comes from technological advance in terms of genetics in plant breeding, and also the use of plant protection products, what we would call pesticides, to control other plants so we get the maximum yield from what we're doing. And that kind of has been necessary. And as we look at world trends going forward, and this much quoted figure that by 2050 we will have approximately 9.5 billion people on this planet, significantly more than we have now. and the FAO indicating to us that if we compare 2009 figures with 2050 figures, we need to see an increase over that period in agricultural production of somewhere between 60 to 70%. That's a big ask of society to produce more for an increasing amount, an increasing population. At a time when we see increased urbanisation, which is taking productive land out of agricultural production. In the last 25 years in GB, we have lost 1.9 million acres of land to urbanisation and forestation. Now, 1.9 million, put that in context, we have 2.5 million in Northern Ireland. So 3/4 of Northern Ireland's landmass has been lost in GB over the last 25 years from agricultural production to facilitate a growing urban population. So this is not to criticise the fact we all need a house and somewhere to live, of course not, but this is just to contextualise the fact that this is the type of the challenge that we as an industry and a society face. The challenge is not actually climate change. The challenge is how we feed a growing population during climate change, and that's where we get back to looking at how we do that, and that is about finding more sustainable production systems, more sustainable farming. And that is something we want to see really emphasised here in Northern Ireland. We think we have, because of our scale, which is small by any sort of international standards, that gives us certain advantages. So we have, for instance, we are currently more than just over halfway through a world-leading process where we are testing every single field in Northern Ireland has been soil tested. Now, that's every single field. And in a world where everything is done by bots and models, we are actually sending people out on the ground into every single field and taking a soil sample and taking it off for analysis, and that will give us a baseline of what the soil in Northern Ireland is like. And from that baseline, then we can work upwards, because these things need to be baselined, and soil is fundamental in this process. Another thing we're doing here in Northern Ireland, which I think will be critical to how we take this journey forward, we are just embarking on a process where we are going to carbon footprint every single farming business in Northern Ireland. So we will use one single carbon calculator tool. Again, it's not been done anywhere else, and every single farm will do a carbon survey of their business, and that will again baseline where that business is, and then using that information we will look to obviously improve that, reduce the carbon footprint of those businesses going forward, because by reducing the carbon footprint we do a couple of things. We increase the inputs going in, we maximise the outputs going out, we create efficiencies within the productive system which makes it more sustainable, and the big bonus is it makes our farmers more profitable, because those inputs which are being lost, whether it be into excess nutrients into Lough or whatever it is money that is leaving our industry and quite literally floating away. So in Northern Ireland, I think we are well on our way in terms of our agricultural industry in tackling and addressing a number of these issues. I did say I'd mention a couple of things, maybe slightly controversial. Maybe mention one now, if I have time, Louise, just to
I'll give you another minute.
Throw something at you, which I came across. It was a survey the Pew Research Institute did. Maybe you know this, Martin. Appeared in Time magazine in America now, so it's American people. So let's forgive them that. But that's where it was done. And they surveyed people, Christians, people of faith, and their attitude towards climate change. And of that survey, they found 61% of the people surveyed were climate skeptics. They were reluctant to believe that this was all man-made in terms of climate change. This was, and that comes from a deep belief in creation and God having an overview and a control, and there'll always be a seed time and a harvest, and all that, that sort of stuff. And if you compare that figure of 61% from a high Christian perspective, people of faith, to people of non-faith, the figure there, which they found in the survey to be similarly climate skeptic, was I think 26%. So big difference. So there is a challenge, I think, for people of faith to address: is this a man-made phenomena, climate change? Is this natural? is this something that we need to concern ourselves with, or is this something we leave to somebody else? So that's my question a little bit to you, which I'd like to get some of your views back on as well, and yourself, Martin, as well, to see, because I think that to me, whenever I read that survey, was quite provoking, and the more I thought about it, the more it is, because quite often, science and religion, they're not very close bedfellows in many ways. Creation versus evolution. There's a lot of history of distrust and dislike there, and so I think it's something we need to maybe think about as well. So.
When we were chatting just before, John, and we were talking about, you mentioned about that survey and that sort of conflict and uneasiness between creation and evolution and so on. But also we talked about interpretation, because a lot of those fundamental kind of churches would rely very heavily on the Bible and interpretation. And Martin, I'm interested to hear what you think. When we look to the Bible, we're told that, we look after the land, we are the stewards of the land, but how does that role get interpreted, and how do we put it in place, and how are churches today rising to that?
I mean, I think, and you've already commented, John, the Americans are very odd. Let's be quite frank. And I think one has got to view that America is particularly peculiar in terms of this, because worldwide, the UN acknowledged that the faiths, and in particular Christianity, because it's been most active in this field, are the largest sector of civil society that is engaged in the environmental movement, far bigger than any other sector. However, there are those for whom this is challenging. And I think I've always argued, and I've watched this over the years, because the first time I went and spoke about these issues in America, and this was in 1987, in California, in Berkeley, I was barracked by 500 evangelicals because as an environmentalist, they thought I was stopping the coming of the Messiah, because the book of Revelation describes everything collapsing and then Christ will return. And so they saw me as the forerunner of the Antichrist, which is a bit disappointing. I mean, I'd rather be actually the Antichrist itself, because it's a bit more of a bigger... I mean, who really hears about John the Baptist? I mean, you just don't. So anyway, so there was that issue. And I went out to talk to them as an Anglican, which means I can believe pretty much whatever I want. And trying to debate with them about my understanding of the Bible, I realized I couldn't. There was no common ground at all. At all. And I came back in from this attempt and concluded that it would have to come from within that tradition. And it has. The World Evangelical Alliance has created a whole sustainability center and program. It has staff working on this. It has produced guidelines on ethical investment, on environmental sustainability. But I think I would argue that at one level, that's one of the most honest surveys you could find, because I think most people, they really don't want to spend their time thinking about this. And so if you can kind of say, it's in the hands of God, then at one...
relieve you of responsibility?
It does, but I think it also relieves you of anxiety. And what I found with those evangelicals who were against... even thinking about there being an environmental crisis, when I pushed them later on, I found that they all actually knew far more about the level of the environmental crisis than most people. And they realized how absolutely bloody terrifying this was. And they retreated. But they retreated because they could see the scale of it. And, in other faiths we have the same problem. But I think the key issue is how do we make this sufficiently intelligible that we feel we can have some purchase on it. And very interested in the figures you're giving us there, John, but nobody was ever converted by a pie chart. We're moved and changed by story. And you will have stories about why you've gone into the alternative energy, sustainable energy world, which will be actually of more interest to me than those figures. Because as a friend of mine who was the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, said, why do we call things numbers? Because they numb us. So I think what the faiths bring is the power of story. When we're battered with data, and I was at COP in 1997 when we knew what we needed to do on climate change, and then the Americans sabotaged it by carbon trading, which is essentially the sale of indulgences, which we had a reformation for. Oh, quite. Most of you are Catholics. We had a reformation, by the way, and we did a lot of changes. You may not have noticed. So I think, for me, the challenge is, and very often people say, well, we feel the faiths are the answer. Well, yes, another Pew survey, John, is that 80% of the world's population claim membership in one of the major religions, which means we might be part of the solution, but at the moment we're mostly the problem, because it's our lifestyles that are driving this. So it's a huge conundrum. If we're looking for simple goodies and baddies, and I'm sure you've had to experience this as a farmer, that's about as useful. I can't even think of anything that's even more useless, because that's not where the answers lie. The answers have to lie in alliances. And one of the most interesting experiments I've seen on this in terms of farming is community-supported agriculture in the US and now in many other countries, because one of the great problems for farmers is the variable return that you get depending on weather and diseases and so on and so forth. So it started with the Jewish communities in America. They committed to local farms that they would provide a guaranteed income. And if the crops were very successful, then they would have a bumper harvest and they would have lots of food. If it was a bad harvest, they'd get what there was, but they'd still pay the same amount. Because the degree to which we ask farmers to take the risks for us, I think is not only unsustainable, I think it's deeply, deeply morally flawed. So, yes, the faiths are part of the problem, but they've also begun to wake up.
And that model, I mean, that's very difficult to extrapolate and relate to other places. You know, here where we have 26,000 farms, 23,000 of them very small, one operator. John, you have shifted your focus to that renewable energy side of things, and you've moved away from dairy herding and so on. Why has that move mattered to you? You were speaking at the Regenerative Festival Feels Good there last week as well about this.
Yeah, it's. I mean, again, this is my own view. I believe that land, and I'm privileged to, I feel, to be a farmer and to have responsibility, custodianship for a short period of time for a piece of land that my father and his father and his father and whatever had a similar duty of care towards. But I think land is multifunctional. I think it's wrong to think of it in one capacity, and I mean that's maybe so obvious it shouldn't even be said, because we already think of it like that. I think sometimes we think of farming as food, but and our land as food, but it is so much more than that. It is food, it is energy, which we have I suppose moved our business more from a food model to an energy model, and I'll explain why I did that in a second. But I suppose the more general point is that I feel my personal responsibility is towards that piece of land, which I feel lucky to be custodian for, and to pass it on to another generation, and hopefully instill in them some of those values of that custodianship for that piece of land again. I changed my business approximately 2007. Milk price was 13 pence. It's probably cost me about 18, 20 pence to produce a litre of milk. Every litre of milk that went out the gate, I was losing money on. It was modern day slavery. The people who were buying my milk knew that I was losing money. The people who were buying that milk in the supermarket, wouldn't have been hard for them to work out that I was losing money. Yet nobody cared about that in the least. And I slavery was wrong in the last century. It's wrong in every regard in this century. And I felt at that time that that's what I was doing. I was in a business model okay, take the slavery bit out of it. It was a business model that I didn't like. I was very much a price taker in a market where I had no control, and I didn't like that. I saw an opportunity to move my business into a different sector, which was the energy sector. There was a political incentivisation around that time. It was a coalition government between Lib Dems and Conservatives, which for the first time recognised the need that the UK needed to move towards more homegrown renewable energies, and we saw a growth in all types of energy. We went from a very low base to where we are today. Around about 50% of the energy produced in Northern Ireland, used in Northern Ireland, is produced in Northern Ireland. I mean, that's phenomenal. I mean, if you go out of here and we're driving up the road and every other car you met was made in Northern Ireland, that would be, that would be quite phenomenal. So we did that in energy over that short period of time because we had the right everything was in the right place. So we have policy was right. Policy was right. There was incentivisation there, which recognised this is something which had to be financially incentivised. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important to remember that. I mean, I talk about what I see as a personal custodial responsibility. I also have to make a living. I have to pay for my kids to go to university. They're very expensive. One of them. These are things we all have to do. There aren't too many people questioning a number of our civil servants whenever they have been asking for pay rises over the last little while. I mean, farmers saw prices rise, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and people got very annoyed because all the prices of their food went up. I mean, all it was doing was getting food prices to where, had they followed a normal inflationary pattern, they should have been anyway. So food has been undervalued by society. That's the bottom line on it. I had an opportunity within my business to do something different, so I took that opportunity. I think society recognises the value of food better now than it did then, like it's only whatever it is, 15 years ago. So we still do produce food on the farm in the form of our beef enterprise and our egg enterprise. I see absolutely no reason why we won't go back to perhaps a dairy enterprise in the future. But it's about taking. I mean, farmers are simple people. Actually, we're not complicated. We kind of like to make some money from what we do. I know it's a terrible concept. Imagine, So we will follow market signals, and and we have had market signals. Go back to those figures about how we've doubled and trebled and stuff. That was the market telling us. It was society. This was you people telling us, we want more of this. We want more chicken. We want more whatever. So we as farmers, we start to produce it. Now, if society tells us, well, actually, we've got enough of that stuff and we'd rather you grew more trees, farmers will do that. If the right incentivisation mechanism is put in place. Now, some will do it quicker than others. But because that's just because not everybody's, we're not all robots. But we're not complicated. We follow we follow market signals. So the question goes back to society. We can produce you more sustainable food. We can reduce the carbon footprint of your food. But it's going to cost you a wee bit more.
Yeah, and you've mentioned there about that connectivity of everything, how geopolitical shock thousands of miles from here was felt by each and every one of us in our weekly supermarket shop. We're kind of breaking down a little bit those disconnects. In that sense, people are now very aware of that. And it's something that our newly returned government have talked about a lot, silos, getting out of silos. And one of those situations where we see that very much is, it would be remiss of me not to go to it directly, is Lough, where there are so many different aspects of society, of governance, everything involved in addressing that situation. Now, farmers obviously have a big role to play in tackling this. You're being asked to rise to a lot in the Lough Action Plan and so on. But also, Martin, individuals, communities, churches, you all have a role. How does that governance kind of work its way down from strategic level to local communities to the individuals taking action, being part of the solution?
That's a very good question, and I very much like the way John was talking about following demand. I think the main role of the faiths is that we can be those who ask for other things. We are purchasers, we are investors, and the faiths are big land owners. They are big investors. We are the fourth largest investing community in the world, with $14 trillion worth. About 12% of the total investment market is owned by main faiths, never mind individuals who are faith motivated. And I think on the food one, this is a really interesting one, because the gap, so I often get asked to go and talk or to preach so I was asked to preach at Bath Abbey for Harvest Festival. And they asked me to talk at the Harvest dinner the night before about the work I do and the religion and environment and so forth. And they wanted me to preach at Matins and Holy Communion on the Sunday. And about a month before, I got in touch with the dean and I said, can I just ask, what's your purchasing policy? And he went, I said, have you got a purchasing policy? Well, no, not really. So I said, so the food that we're going to have for a harvest festival on the theme of religion and environment, how much local, how much organic, how much fair trade, etc., how free range. And it was as though I was talking to him in Swahili. He hadn't a clue. Hadn't for a moment thought about the correlation between what he was going to have wonderful hymns about, lovely readings from the Bible, a lovely talk from me, sermon, no connection whatsoever. So over the next fortnight, we went through every item that they were going to purchase. He got very excited at one point, at the very early point. I said, well, what about locally? He said, oh, yes, our apple crumble is made by a lady from her own trees. I went, great, that's a good start. Now let's work our way back through the rest of the stuff. What kind of milk are you using? Where is it coming from? What are the goods? Where are your apples coming, etc.? And it was such a fascinating correspondence. We produced a book called Food and Faith in 2018. With stories from all around the world of how the faiths, as both growers of food, so for example in Ethiopia there are 36,000 Ethiopian priests, of those 28,000 are farmers. That's how they make their living. They don't get paid by the church. They farm the church land, and that's where they get their money from. So we had those stories. And so I got his permission, and we put the series of emails between me and the dean of the Abbey all the way through the book at different interviews, because it showed the disconnect. Another thing that we did, we worked very closely with the Eat Foundation and the Lancet, and they produced in 2020, I think it was 2019, their survey on food production, health, and health of the planet. And some of it's a bit wacky, but much of it is just bloody good common sense. And so they came to us and said, we're very conscious about the faiths as landowners, and we've had a big program on organic farming all around the world. We work with 4 big organic training centers, one run by the Shintos, one run by Buddhists, 2 by Christian networks, where we can take people to help them see how to shift. And I'll come back to how you fund that in a minute. So we had all that dimension. But we also did a survey on how many meals the faiths serve every day. Because we knew that the Sikhs in India, through their gurdwaras, where they have the langar, which is the free kitchen, they feed 23 million people every single day for nothing. So I thought, blimey, well, if that's what they're doing. Well, it's 500 million meals a day. So that focusing on the purchasing policy of the faiths in terms of food has been a big focus. And that's where things like the community-supported agriculture, where precisely your point, who is going to pay us for this if it isn't there? Well, the faiths are. And it's a model I would really recommend here. But the final issue here is the faiths as investors. What we know is that for a farm or an agricultural venture of any kind owned and run by the faiths, to shift from chemical fertilizers or from mass production of forestry, woods, monocrops and so forth, is incredibly expensive. and nobody pays for that. Well, we do. We've set up, through many of the faiths, particularly the Scandinavian churches are very good on this, funds to invest in farms or in agriculture or in forestry to make that transition. So we're not asking the farms or the forest workers to carry the cost, because why would you? That's just not a good thing to do. And every major faith now has funds on that. But we've just struck a deal with the Green Climate Fund, which invests $30 billion a year in developing countries, and it came out of the Paris 2015 COP, and it takes money from the developing world to invest in adaptation and mitigation in the developing world, so developed to the developing. And we've made that a major focus. So we're asking faiths now to invest in programs that the Green Climate Fund will guarantee first loss, which means that a faith investment group can invest in, for example, a program such as Farming God's Way or Islamic farming, which is based on biblical and Quranic principles of land management, but into which we can then bring in modern technologies and wisdom. And we now can put in the funding to invest in infrastructure change, because your point is a fundamental one, John. To make any change, somebody has to fund the infrastructure. We're now doing that. Not at the scale I would hope, but given that when we first did the event in 1986 with the faiths and the environment, there were 3 religious environmental projects in the entire world, 1 Buddhist, 1 Christian, 1 multi-faith. UN now estimates there's 1.5 million religious environmental projects. I think what we need, John, is much more the communities like yours to come to us and say, this is what we need. We need to have investment, or even we need to have guaranteed income. We have the finances. Come and ask us.
And that's an interesting proposition, because you are being asked to make a lot of those changes, and with incoming policy around farming with nature and the different shift in focus, it's part of a just transition, because you cannot be left behind.
Yeah, and I mean, just transition is a phrase we hear talked about in terms of how we move from a production system which was purely productive driven to one which now takes into account, like we talked about earlier, all the outputs from a farming system. I mean, I haven't heard of any religious environmental projects in Northern Ireland, Martin. I don't know if there are any or not. I mean, certainly we'll talk about it afterwards if there is. It is an interesting concept. I mean, we do, I suppose to put it, I mean, again, it's all about context, I suppose. I mean, Northern Ireland farming, so Northern Ireland has one big farm, brings in, I think, somewhere about, made somewhere like 350 odd million, whatever. But whenever we take out farm support out of it, Northern Ireland, all of Northern Ireland farming made £42 million last year. Yeah, purely from the value of the product they sold. So 42 million across 26,000 farms. I mean, Neymar sold for 200 million when he moved to PSG. So, you know, so we're not even getting half of a left leg of Neymar, you know, if we wanted to. So 42 million for all our farms. So there needs to be a commercial aspect to this, Martin. And you're quite right to identify that. We as farmers, like I said earlier, we need to be commercially active. I mean, I take a slightly different view on some of the aspects of it. I think it is very possible to have sustainable, profitable agriculture, which is not too dissimilar from how we currently do it. I don't think it needs to be organic. No, do you? No, because I know you've mentioned that a couple of times. I think there's a place for organic farming for sure. But certainly anything that when we look at the demand for organic produce through our supermarkets, it pretty much fell off a cliff. You know, whenever we had a cost of living crisis. So again, there has to be a connect between the consumer who wants to buy the product, what they're wanting, what they're looking for in the product, and what we as farmers can provide for them. But I think there is potential. I think we can do what we do more sustainably. I think that's the secret. I think Northern Ireland can demonstrate it very well. I think Lough, come back to our famous Lough, I think will be a useful barometer as we go forward in terms of how we demonstrate that sort of more sustainable production system. Now, agriculture started that journey, I'd like to think, 15 years ago, whenever we started looking at nutrient loss from farms, and that continues. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details of it, but it continues, and we have more and more farms looking at how they can manage all that sort of effluent and runoff from their farms. And you mentioned Farm with Nature, which is a government policy which is looking to change a little bit how we farm our land. And within that, we will look at things like putting in buffer strips around the edges of fields. You'll know this better than me, Martin, but I think it's somewhere in Leviticus that talks about mow your fields, but not to the corners.
Absolutely.
You know, so be prepared to leave a bit behind. You know,
for the birds and the orphans and the widows.
Absolutely. So, like, I know that wasn't wrong then, and I
No,
don't think it's.
right on there, mate.
I don't think it's wrong now either. So, you know, so yeah. The point is, the point again, it comes back to land use and how we as an industry look to use that land, and we are up for all suggestions, including yours, Martin. If there is a church-based fund out there which wants to help motivate and stimulate that change of production systems, certainly, you know, we're more than happy to look at that. I look at the fact that the vast majority of income to farm comes through government support mechanism, which is taxpayers' money, recognition of the fact that, you know, we're producing a public good in the form of food. So that's where we're currently addressing how that future policy and how that future production systems will look, which is that just transition piece and how we manage our land.
Well, I have monopolised both of you so far. Time is ticking on. I really want to hear your questions. Again, this is a forum for discussion, respectful sharing and exchange of opinions and thoughts. So I'm not sure if we have a roving mic at all, but we have two. Brilliant. This man's hand has just shot straight up in the blue check shirt. So can we hear from yourself? If you'd like to introduce yourself, just so that we know, and address your question then. And we'll keep questions brief so we can try and get as much in as we can.
Okay, first of all, point of clarification for John. I'm Robin Tweed, Tweed's Farm above Carn Castle. You know my cousin there. But I'm involved in Jubilee Farm, a Christian environmental project at Glynn, which is not far from here. Involved in conservation and care farming, community supported agriculture. So you'd be very welcome to visit. I do have a question, particularly for John. You know, looking toward net zero and 2050 and being aware of the high level of agriculture emissions that were recorded in Northern Ireland, how can UFU encourage farmers to move away to transition from intensive meat production to more sustainable method of food production?
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Robin. Yeah, net zero 2050 is a massive challenge. Not just to agriculture, but to all of society in Northern Ireland. I mean, interestingly, the Climate Change Committee, who are the recognised experts in this area, said that for UK to meet a net zero target by 2050, Northern Ireland didn't quite have to, because it recognised that our biggest single industry is agriculture. A large part of that is cattle, and cattle produce a thing called methane, and methane is a very difficult gas to manage under the current inventory system. We're not getting too much detail, but the point is, for the UK to meet its 2050 net zero target, Northern Ireland needed to get to about 80% net zero, and our very wise politicians decided that no, we should just go 100%. That has created a massive challenge. 80% was a challenge. To go 100% is a bigger and quite frankly unnecessary challenge. And why that's kind of important, Robin, because sometimes when you set a target that is unachievable, people don't even try. So that's where I think we will and we do, and we talk to our political parties regularly, and we would encourage them to revisit the climate change legislation that Northern Ireland has in place. Not because we're climate deniers by any means, but we actually believe that if the target is where it should have been to begin with, it's more realistic. We will get better buy-in from not just from farmers but from all of society. So that's the first point on net zero. Having said that, we're on our way. We have a 2030 target, which with current measures being proposed, put in place, we will get pretty close to in agriculture. Now, this is in agriculture. Transport and other sectors have their own targets. Once we get past 2030, Rob, we're into difficult territory because of the methane factor. Now, methane has not been measured correctly, so there's a hope that will be corrected through it's an international system, and it's not something we can change, but that work is ongoing to try and get that recognised as being something that needs to be just needs to be more realistic, more scientific in its basis. It will need more technology. The 2050 net zero target for Northern Ireland will not be met with current technology. We're going to have to do something that we haven't quite invented yet. And 2050 is not that far away, actually. This is this, and we've spun our wheels for far too long, doing very little, actually. And it sometimes concerns me. We're very pleased to have an executive back up and running again. They were out of action for a little while, as we all know. But it's just slow. It is slow getting anything done. We need to recognise that we have to change, but to change, oh goodness, well, where we must have been planning legislation. So if I, as a farmer, want to put in place a livestock system to replace an old livestock system, and with that new livestock system, have a system which is healthier for the livestock, healthier for me, the farmer, better for the environment because we control the ammonia levels coming out of it or whatever, I cannot currently get it passed through planning. And that is a massive roadblock, even though I'm not increasing production. So, for instance, we have a pig industry who are being asked by their customers to give more room to the pigs. Very commendable. Increase the room per pig by 25%. But to do that, they have to increase the size of their sheds, obviously, and planning, they can't get planning approval to do that. So there's a lot of disconnect within a lot of this. There's aspirational targets, but we have to get real and realistic about how we're going to reach those targets, and everything needs to get a bit more joined up. But I still have optimism, Robin. I still think we can do it. I think it is about sustainable production and how we can demonstrate that. And I think we are already quite well progressed down that road. But there's a lot of work still to do.
It's important to say too that there was a bit of a derogation for agriculture in that climate change target setting, in that methane production or methane emissions were to be limited to 46%. So that is a recognition of the challenge, but also, as the other side of the coin would say, well, it's a bit of a Bible for agriculture as well. But that's a wider thing to maybe discuss, and we want to get some more questions as well, of course.
I think the important thing with methane is we start measuring it accurately.
Yeah, it's all down to the science.
We're not doing that at the minute. No, we have to follow the proper science on it.
That's it. Science is everything, and we're back to science and creation again. Right, let's get some more of your questions. Any more people? Pop your hands up. People are pointing. Go on. Anyone got any more questions for the minute? I'm keen to hear. Oh, your microphone, sorry.
Oh, sorry. So we've done a great deal of work in Mongolia with the Buddhist communities in Mongolia in a very interesting program which looked at the sacred texts. There are 840 sutras, Buddhist texts, associated with the landscape of Mongolia: sacred mountains, sacred rivers, sacred valleys. And these are extraordinarily prescriptive and descriptive. So you will get, for example, the Bogdan mountain outside Ulaanbaatar, very sacred, has 15 different sutras, and there's one for one particular area where it says, if you cut down the trees on this side of the mountain, the goddess will flood your village. So these were written somewhere between about the 13th and 15th century. Just out of interest, and with a project with the World Bank, we worked in parallel with the World Bank's analysis of the vulnerable areas of the landscape of Mongolia. Where could be developed, where could forestry be revived, where was some sort of sustainable agriculture possible, cattle in particular and so forth. And they mapped almost exactly the same areas. The Buddhist sutras knew 500 years ago where the vulnerable areas were and protected them. That had been scrapped under communism, where everything was just mechanized and all the traditional knowledge and wisdom of the sustainability of places. And then into this mixture came a very well-intentioned, totally stupid environmental group from the States who had done this thing about all these cattle and horses that the Mongolian nomads had, and had worked out that there was all this methane gas coming. So they arrived with a proposal that they would give every family that would slaughter their entire livestock a color television. Mongolian ger hunts don't have electricity. So quite where they were going to plug this television in, I don't know. But this sort of bogeyman of cattle. If we get rid of it, we solve the problem. That would have totally destroyed the entire culture of Mongolia overnight. So this sometimes we see in the environmental movement a kind of, I don't know what the right word is, a desire to make things change now. Whereas my experience as an environmentalist is everything takes time. And if you don't give it time, you've usually made the wrong decision. So I'm with you on this sort of time. And I think that's why what we're arguing to our faith investment communities, and we had a meeting with the Catholic bishop today, and at one moment, the poor exhausted man, after I'd beaten him into the ground, actually said, yes, will you come and talk to our finance officers about where our investments are? So we need, and one of the problems we have is that we're sitting on about Faith Invest, which I am the president of. We have access to about $100 billion of religious investment. Our problem is we don't have things to invest in. We've outstripped the market for investable projects, which is why we joined with the Green Climate Fund, because they have mega projects like entire solar farms in Ghana and agricultural schemes in the Congo and so forth, where we can get to scale, but we're also having to say some of that scale is to do with the ego of the politicians and actually nothing to do with what the people really want. So what we're also looking for, to be honest, John, is we're looking for investable projects. We need a return. This is not charity. This is about getting a return. It's about saying, if we help build the infrastructure, and faiths invest on average for 25 years, they're not in for 3 years and then capitalize. Come to us with some projects. Tell us what you want. Tell us there's an honest return. On average, faiths will have a sector that goes 2 to 3% return, not 10 or 15%. So a role that the faiths can play is actually being faith consistent in their investments. At the moment, the vast majority of faiths, well, it's improved. Over the last 5 years, it's gone from 15% to 50% of the faiths, what they say they believe in and where they invest now tallies to some degree. But give us some projects, John, because I think what we're very conscious of is that the kind of changes that governments and environmental movements glibly suggest we should do, and the UN is one of the worst bodies on this, have absolutely no account of the costs, no account of the need to set up infrastructure. So, for example, we're working with the major religious development agencies, none of which currently have an investment program. They give grants. They give $7 billion a year in grants. Most of those are for 2-3 years. Occasionally you get 5. And at the end of the 2, 3, 5 years, the projects collapse because they were reliant upon charity. We're saying set up a 10% of your funds as investment. Identify the projects that you know, because in many cases you started, say, women's cooperatives in beekeeping and bee production, honey production in Kenya. You know who's good out there. Give them the investment to scale up the infrastructure so that they are no longer in a servile role to your charity. Give them the ability to be independent. And that means giving them investing, mixture of grants, mixture of investing. Give them the wherewithal to build the infrastructure. But your point about bureaucracy...
Where do we start?
I don't know where we start.
And
again, I think, that is an area where people of faith can actually raise these issues on behalf, because people of faith have a little bit more time sometimes than farmers do, because we're not out there until the sun goes down. So part of what we can do is advocate. And we can be good at advocation. Advocation? No, advocacy, thank you. We're not terribly good at English, but we're quite good at advocacy. So I think there is a huge area, but I think what I'm hearing from John is the challenge is all very well, who is going to walk this walk with us? Well, I would like to suggest that it could be the faiths. In fact, in many places is, and I'll certainly link you. We have here, at the back, we have Arosha and eco-congregations. How many churches are there that are now eco-congregations in Northern Ireland? So those are churches that have already made a commitment about their own land use, their purchasing policy, their energy use, food. So there is a basis that we can work from.
And is there then a scope, if you're divesting money away from fossil fuels and so on, if you're redirecting your financial power, is there the scope there to create real change? Because we don't realise, as consumers, as individuals, the power that the money in our pocket actually has in those choices.
Absolutely. I mean, I have a problem with disinvestment because, on the whole, it's a kind of moral grandstanding. Because basically, it doesn't stop money being invested in fossil fuels. It just means some more rapacious hedge fund manager has bought it instead, who doesn't give a toss about social justice or just transition. They're just going to make more money. And more money has gone into fossil fuels since the disinvestment program took off than was going in before. The problem is, please do disinvest if that helps you and makes you feel better. The question is, where do you put the money afterwards? Because if you're saying we can't have fossil fuels, would you kindly invest in how we get other sources of energy? Because otherwise, you're basically having a kind of lovely monastic experience of self-flagellation, but it's bugger all use for actually changing the systems. It really is.
Yeah, it's purpose, isn't it? I'm conscious, anybody, I guess we have a lady here with a hand. Did we get a yellow mic? And another gentleman, Alan, here as well. We'll take another question.
Hello,
yes.
I'm Eleanor Duff. I grew up on the shores of Lough in a place called Ardbow. I'm now living in beautiful Ballycastle, or just outside it. But I'm very concerned and aggrieved at the situation in Lough. There are virtually no flies there now. We used to be plagued with them in April. So that's the food source of the eels gone. And I spoke not so long ago to a local fisherman who said fishing's finished here. And it just breaks my heart to think of how we've allowed that travesty to happen.
I think it's really galvanised people. It's maybe something, I'm not sure, Martin, you'll certainly be aware of it, John. But I think Lough has suddenly taken a place in people's minds. It's been a blue blob on a map for most of us.
Yeah. Here's the reality. For 50 years, we used Lough as a secondary treatment system for our sewage. That's the reality of it. It was a biological treatment system. It worked, and it worked pretty good. We didn't treat it properly. When it left, we put it into a very poor treatment system, and it overflowed and it went into the Lough. And the Lough kind of took care of it for 50 years, or maybe even longer, and nobody cared. Nobody really worried about it. And we're all actually, society was quite pleased, because you know what it meant you didn't have to do for those 50 years? You weren't paying water rates. And you weren't treating your water, you weren't treating your own sewage properly as it left your house. You were letting Lough do it. Lough did it, and then it got to a saturation point, and other factors came into play. And I've already admitted agriculture has been part of that, so I'm not just picking on households, but it is important that we do say it, I think. And then other factors came into play. The introduction of the zebra mussel was pivotal in what happened to Lough, and that's probably why the eels left, because they don't like it. They don't like the water being clear. So that's what's happened. So, okay, so let's accept all of that. Now, the thing is, what are we going to do going forward? So my question to you in society is, are you going to pay water rates? I pay for the water I use on my farm. My cattle pay for water, but yet nobody within, I don't know what radius you want to take from where we're sitting right now, domestically is paying for water.
In the 1960s, there was a man called Rick Batterby who worked for the University of Ulster and identified the pollution back then. So we've just been sitting, looking at it, but doing nothing. Mm-hmm. So by raising water taxes, it's not going to solve the problem. It has to be traced right through to source, and accountability has to come into it.
Yeah, no, I think there needs to be a better treatment at source. You described those water treatment plants need to be upgraded. I mean, whether it's water rates or whether it's a tax, I don't really mind. I mean, it's not up to me. It's not it's not for me to have any say in it. But I think I suppose it's that little bit of a question again about everybody wants A, B, C, D, and E. But unfortunately, you can't have all of them. There has to be a compromise somewhere in this process. And I think Lough is a good example to society. Now, I've already said as farmers, we were only concerned with production. It was about producing more litres of milk, more kilos of beef. So whatever allowed us to do that, that's what we did, without recognition that there were also more manure being produced, higher phosphorus being produced. That wasn't being taken up sufficiently by the plants because we didn't have that baseline soil analysis, which we will now have. So all of those things have factored into it. So Lough is sad. It is disappointing that it has happened. We can all take the blame. Let's all hold our hands up and say, yeah, we caused this. The important thing really is what we do next and how we go forward. So really Lough is about let's find solutions for how we do it. Our sector has started that journey. There's lots more we can do. And we're happy to do them. But let's do that. Let's not worry about the blame aspect of it. That's one of the biggest sadness in Lough was that for 12 months we just couldn't find enough people to blame for it. Instead of just going like, this has happened, now how are we going to fix it? And so I really want us as a society, farmers, I say we've started our journey. I want us all to let's fix Lough. And Lough will be the barometer which shows progress in society. Now it's going to take a while, and it may be our children who see it, but that's good enough for me. To be honest, I'm happy to do what I need to do now, if it means that they can swim in Lough or whatever, in the future. So.
And you mentioned accountability for people of faith, Martin. Where is accountability? Where does that lie? How do they direct? Again, we're back to choice and personal responsibility.
Well, I think what we rather sweetly call democracy is one way, but it's a very minimal way. I think it does come down to really one of the issues that John has totally highlighted, which is our purchasing power. The fact that we can create markets and we can break markets. So you talk about the collapse in organic foods because of the austerity and so forth, and a living cost crisis. I think that calls for us to make greater sacrifices from our side. We have a very interesting group. The Methodist Church in the town above where I live runs a food bank. And there was a huge discussion at one point as to whether the food that they were providing was always crap food. It was cheap, it was exploitative, it was bad, but it was enough because it's for the poor, so it doesn't really matter, does it? Huge debate, which then led them to start looking at raising more money to buy better food in order that you were not maintaining this cycle of exploitative relationship with nature. And I had one wonderful meeting. A very good friend of ours farms near Bath, big dairy farm, big cheese producers, organic, so on and so forth. And at one point we were approached by the Hindu community in the UK, and particularly by Bhaktivedanta Manor, which is the big Hindu centre given to the Hare Krishna movement by George Harrison many years ago, which has a huge herd, and they never kill any of the cattle at all. They die of old age, and the oxen are kept for pulling the wagons around and so on and so forth. But we set up a system called Ahimsa milk. Ahimsa is the is the Sanskrit word for non-violence. And we discovered that there was a huge market in the Hindu community for milk that was produced from cattle that were allowed to live until they died. And when I brought this group to meet Graham, our farmer friend, he said, well, that's very nice, that's all very well, but how much are you charging for a pint of milk? And they said, and this was 15 years ago, £4.50. And he went, you'll never get anybody to pay for that. We now have 80 farms and we can't meet the demand because that milk is based on a value system that says the cow is sacred. And we do not want any suffering for that cow. We will pay the difference. That market is held stable and it's growing. We can't get enough Ahimsa milk. There are now, as I say, 80 farms. And when we set this up, there were 17. Graham still expresses considerable scepticism every time I meet him, and he goes, "Go on, tell me how much those Hindus are paying for their milk." Oh, bloody hell. But I think we should be creating markets that reflect our values. We don't. We kind of switch in and we do a little bit here and a little bit there. The kind of shifts that John is talking about, the kind of shifts that the people we work with in the agricultural world, kind of shifts that the UN, we work a lot with the United Nations Development Programme, nature-based solutions, which is investing in and working with what nature does best, far better than we've ever done. Those are all very hopeful, but it does rely in the end on you as the consumer saying, yeah, I will pay for this. Now, whether it's water rates, I have no idea about the water rates. That's extraordinary. Either you can leave it to the governments if you want. Oh, there's a lot of shaking heads here. I'm stunned at the skepticism here. I thought we all approved of governments. Or we can take it into our own hands. And I will go back to the community-supported agriculture. Now, I've heard from a lot of people, oh, well, the congregations are too small here. Well, combine. It's not bloody rocket science, is it? Get together, be in touch with the UFU, and say, where most would it make a real difference for the changes if we were able to guarantee a farmer that she could have this level of income?
Just as a point of interest, I was told there about 10 days ago or so in the last couple of weeks, Northern Ireland is one of 4 places in the world that does not pay for water. I'll just leave that there. But I know, but that's a discussion for another night. I'm conscious the clock is ticking and I don't want to hold you back from your tea. I know this lady, and also Alan had a question as well over here in the corner too, so we will try and get through these 2 questions very quickly, and I don't want to hold you back from your tea. There's Alan. Alan, pop your hand up there, and the pink microphone can go to the lady there in the back. We're not gendering, though. Just pink's a nice colour.
Thank you very much, Louise, for the opportunity. Alan Strong, I worship in this church. I'm a retired academic and I chair an arm's length body to do with flooding and drainage. And that brings me to Lough and the fact that, in truth, and my question's about political engagement, in case you think I've lost the run of myself. And it was interesting that you heard the BB preparing for the display. That's joined-up thinking in the most simplest of ways. And this church seeks to be an evangelical church. It's a hearts and minds church. It's developing, evolving an environmental conscience. It seeks to educate people, but ultimately it's about freedom of choice. And it's about an opportunity for people to become better people through faith. So I say that unashamedly on behalf of this community. And this room is used incessantly by groups of people from all shapes and sizes and communities because they like what we do and we like them. And probably the like is more us for them than them for us. And I stand as one of many people who are engaged with that, so it's not about me. My comment about water rates, I couldn't agree with you more, John. And as a retired academic, I fought for that case and still lost it. And Northern Ireland Water, yes, have something to do about treating of the sewage. But you know what becomes around about, it's only yesterday or the way before we talked about fuel poverty. We talked about food security or lack of it. We talked about social injustice. We talked about climate injustice, climate change, changing climate. And where do we have 2 months ago in our summer? Flooding, no, a little bit longer, in the spring, flooding in Downpatrick and in Uri and in Portadown and in Drumahoe and in Eglinton and Shimna and Newcastle. So you know what? We're just following the trend. And we will have, we're having our summer now when we should have had it a few months ago. My point, though, is that the programme for government and things like nature-based solutions, the tools are there. Let me stop. I did a review of winter flooding, and I talked about the flooding of Lough and how it spilt out into many areas, and eventually it couldn't get down to the cuts in Coleraine. Now the blue-green algae makes it down there. The water couldn't make it. And I met several farmers through the auspices of UFU, and one in particular said, I'm finishing, said, I love my farm, but you've ruined it on me. Because it was inundated with water for about 3 weeks, and he immediately wanted to irrigate it and seed it again. And just that was not scientifically possible. He was wedded to his farm, and others said to him, why not look for alternative crops? He was, like you, John, he had generation after generation after generation. It was his farm, and he was not leaving it. His biggest regret is he bought a house a mile away, so he had to drive a mile to see his farm morning, noon and night. So the farming community are immense at the heart of our society, but they're not the only thing. And I think that we need to look at the social agenda and the political agenda. And therefore, I think that we need to be much greater advocates to the alleged bureaucrats. And, who they are, we elected them. And if we didn't vote, then we, by default, elected them. I think we really need to engage. And I think our Assembly is looking so exciting again. And we've got two great female First and Deputy First Ministers. And that engagement is absolutely fundamental, because climate change is not going away. You might think, oh, it's for another age, and then maybe the right-wing evangelicals will say it differently. But at the end of the day, we are where we're at, and we need to solve it here and now. So I could ask lots of other questions, but how are we going to up our ante in terms of political engagement?
I'll ask you for a very brief response so we can get this lady's question
I'll
in
go
and then get you on to your tea.
Very quickly, yeah, they need to be better, but I describe our government as adolescents. I mean, we haven't had government here, and then, really, being in government is extremely difficult. And I think we need to give them a little bit of slack, give them a little bit of time. They are like wayward adolescents, and they're making a pile of mistakes. We can either, just criticise their mistakes, or kind of give them a wee bit of help them, maybe a little bit, as the more mature adult in the room. That's sort of maybe not the best analogy, but that's kind of how I see our Stormont executive. It's better it's there than it's not there, but they need help from us as society, and again, that's our challenge. That's us.
Perhaps the greatest curse of democracy, as the philosopher said, is that the people get the government that they want. This lady at the back, just her final question. Thank you.
Ethel White. I'm a retired crop scientist. I think we should broaden the discussion beyond farms to food systems. I'm actually a fan of short supply chains, so a supporter of farmers' markets. So I think that's actually a real challenge for our farmers, and a lot of them are rising to that. But I think for all of us, the challenge is to support that, because there are people upstream from farmers who sell onto farms. There are people downstream from farmers who buy off farms, and they need to be held accountable for what they produce. We need to be accountable for what we buy, and we need to be accountable for what we buy and waste. And we know the stats about food waste. So my question and encouragement is to say, how do we actually tackle food waste? Because the retailers, once they've sold the food, bless them, they are talking about food waste, but they've made their profit before the food is wasted.
So back to choice.
I've done a lot of work for many years with Compassion in World Farming. A lot of work, produced their first work on multi-faith views on animals and welfare. And we had a big conference about a year ago, and I was only able to join by Zoom, but we had about 700 or 800 people on this Zoom about animal welfare, about food, and it went way beyond, do we have battery chickens or not? It went beyond that. It went into the whole system of food. And at the very end, the chair said, right, to the five of us, one idea that you think could be useful. It's the kind of thing that as a speaker you utterly dread. I did it to two politicians this morning who've been speaking wonderfully to a whole group of young people, and at the very end I said, okay, now tell me the one thing that you do at the moment that you know you shouldn't do for the environment but you haven't given up yet. And honestly, the look of horror and shock on their faces was worth every minute of it. One was a fashionista and realized that she was spending too much on clothes, and the other one was Amazon. So we have this question, and I've been talking for some time with food groups about grace at meals, about the importance of remembering to say thank you. of thinking about what you have on the plate and where it's come from, who's worked on it, etc. The trouble is, almost nobody says grace because very few families now sit together and eat. So in a moment of what I can only call sort of divine inspiration, that doesn't happen very often for me, I said, I think we need to have a grace before we go shopping. Or we need a grace before we put in our order to Tesco's or whoever it is. So that at the point of purchase, not at the point of eating it, because by then it's too late, but at the point of purchase, we have from our different faith traditions, and where there's no faith tradition, from a sense of spirituality or relationship with the rest of nature, we have a moment where we think, thank you. And how can I express that thanks? Because at the moment, we as religious people are often addressing the issue when the food is on our plate. We are not addressing the issue when we decide how we're going to spend our money, limited as it may be, in a way that will make a difference. That's good religion to me.
Yeah, Ethel, great question. A third of our food gets wasted. And interestingly, it's the same in the developed world and the non-developed world, and for different reasons. Though in the developed world, it's because of our spec and stuff, and we think, well, you'll know it's better than me. It's infrastructure issues and
refrigeration in particular, and transport.
Yeah, these sorts of issues. But that's something we need to work on. I mean, we haven't even started to talk about important concepts like One Health. As a society here in Northern Ireland. Or in the UK and Western world, we have probably never been better fed and worse nourished, and that's a really sad indictment of where our food system is. I would rather we were fed a bit less but nourished more. So sitting here, somebody could lose a stone, and it would be no bad thing. But but I think that's something we need to connect with. That is a connection to our food, and if something like a little mantra when you shop, a recognition of the food that you're purchasing. Somebody has worked hard,
where it's come from,
and an animal has given us life, perhaps.
Yes.
That recognition, I think, is something that we should all be thinking about. So.
And we will launch that scheme of a grace before you buy sometime in the early winter.
And I think that sounds like a lovely point on which to end, because the clock is beating us, the tea is being brewed. We could talk for a very, very long time, but let me offer my grace, my thanks to Martin Palmer and to John McLenaghan for a really, really interesting discussion. Thank you to all of you for coming along and being so engaged. A special thanks to Hazel for the request to be here tonight, to Juanita, to Alan, to yourself for keeping us all being able to be heard, and to everybody here for the tea. Thank you all so much for such a lovely welcome, and a heartfelt thanks again to these two gentlemen. Thank you.